My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I'm 63 years old. I never thought my life would unravel over something as simple as a bowl of soup. One moment I was stirring dinner. The next, I was lying on the kitchen floor, with pain burning across my face and the sound of my daughter-in-law's laughter still in my ears. She thought no one saw what she did, that she could humiliate me and walk away untouched. But the neighbor's camera caught everything. That single photo, one flash of truth, spread faster than I could imagine. And from that night on, nothing in my quiet little life was ever the same again. What would you do if the whole world suddenly saw the part of your life you've been hiding the longest? It was one of those evenings when the house smelled of garlic, chicken broth, and something warm that should have felt like home but didn't anymore. Savannah was setting up her camera in the kitchen again. She called it her Cooking with Family live stream. To her, it was a brand, a way to show the world her perfect life. To me, it was just another chance for her to prove I didn't belong in my own kitchen. Ethan had asked me earlier that day to help make my chicken soup, the same one I used to cook for him when he was a boy. I was happy to. It reminded me of the years when he still called me mommy and followed me around with his little bowl. But the moment Savannah stepped into the kitchen, I knew I should have stayed out of the way. She wore her apron that said Sav Cooks. Hair pulled tight. Makeup perfect. Every move rehearsed. She wasn't really cooking. She was performing. I stirred the pot while she adjusted the lighting. Okay, guys, we're making comfort food tonight, she said into her phone. Family recipes passed down from generations. She turned to me. Right. Margaret. I smiled, unsure whether to answer. She always used my full name. Never Mom. Ethan walked in, tired from work, trying to be helpful. Need any help? Honey, he asked. Savannah waved him off. Just stay out of the frame. Babe. The camera doesn't like too many people moving around. I wanted to laugh at that, but I kept quiet. I tasted the soup. It needed salt. But I didn't have time to fix it before she called out. Okay. Time for the big reveal. She picked up the spoon, blew gently, and tasted. Her face froze. What is this? She said. Then louder. Mom, did you even taste it? There's no salt, no spices. This tastes like boiled water. The word Mom hit me like a slap. Not because she said it, but because she only used it when she was angry. My hands trembled on the ladle. I'm sorry. Savannah. I must have forgotten. She laughed. High-pitched. Forced. Forgotten, you've been making this for decades. Right. Guess time really does dull everything. People were still watching. I could see the little hearts floating across her phone screen. My cheeks burned. I reached for the salt, hoping to fix it quietly. But she stopped me. Don't bother. My followers don't need to see incompetence. Ethan said softly. Sav. That's enough. No. It's not enough. She snapped, turning on him. You told me she could help. That it'd be cute. This isn't cute. This is embarrassing. She turned back to me, voice rising. Do you even know how to follow instructions, God? I can't do everything around here. I tried to step back, but my foot caught the edge of the mat. In a second, she was right in front of me. Her face twisted with something I didn't recognize anymore. She grabbed a handful of my hair and shoved me hard. My back hit the cabinet. The pot tipped. Hot soup splashed down my arms. I gasped. Not from pain, but from shock. Ethan shouted. Savannah. The camera fell. The live stream ended with a clatter. For a moment, there was only the hiss of the burner and the sound of soup dripping onto the floor. Savannah stood over me, chest heaving, her eyes wide but not sorry. She looked around, then sneered, her voice low and cold. No one saw that. Margaret, you should be careful what stories you tell. Ethan rushed to help me up. Mom, are you okay? I brushed him off. I'm fine. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. I wiped my arm with a towel. Watching the broth stain spread across the tile, Savannah muttered something under her breath and stormed out of the kitchen. Ethan stood frozen. She didn't mean it, he said finally. She's just stressed. The followers, the sponsors, she's under pressure. I didn't answer. I was too busy trying not to cry. I crouched down, gathering the broken pieces of the bowl, careful not to cut myself. The soup was everywhere, seeping into the cracks of the tile. A mess I couldn't seem to clean fast enough. Mom, let me. I said I'm fine. I didn't look at him. My voice cracked. But I meant it. I didn't need help. Not his kind. Anyway, he left the room, closing the door gently behind him. I sat there for a long time. The kitchen, silent, except for the dripping faucet. The pain in my back pulsed. But it was the silence that hurt more. It wasn't just tonight. It was the months of being ignored, corrected, made to feel small. The way Savannah treated me like an unwanted guest in a house I'd paid for. When I finally looked up, I saw my reflection in the oven glass. Hair disheveled, eyes red. Soup splattered on my shirt. For a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Through the window, the night was dark. The streetlights hazy in the drizzle. Across the fence, I saw a faint glow from Clarice Johnson's living room. She was probably reading, like she always did before bed. I hoped she hadn't seen anything. I rinsed my hands, turned off the stove, and went to my room. My body ached as I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The echo of Savannah's words kept replaying in my head. No one saw that, but someone did. I just didn't know it yet. The morning came with the smell of burnt toast and that kind of silence that feels too heavy to breathe in. I moved slowly, my body stiff from the fall. My arm still tender, where the soup had burned me. Savannah hummed in the kitchen like nothing had happened. I could hear her blender, the click of her phone camera, the sound of her pretending life was perfect again. Ethan had already left for work. He'd barely said a word before walking out the door. I stood in the hallway, listening to Savannah talking to her followers. Her voice was sweet, cheerful, fake. She was filming herself with a mug of coffee. She said things like, "Family time keeps me grounded, and cooking together brings so much love." I went into the kitchen quietly. She didn't look up. On the counter sat a plate of toast and a bowl of fruit she'd made for her video. None of it for me. I filled a small cup with water and took my morning pills, trying not to make a sound. Savannah finally turned, smiling too brightly. "Good morning. Margaret, sleep well." "Fine," I said, though my back ached and my heart felt heavier than it had in years. She looked at my arm. "You should be more careful when you cook," she said. "Burns can look bad on camera." Then she grabbed her keys and was gone. The sound of her heels sharp against the tile. When the door shut, I let myself sit down at the table. The kitchen still smelled faintly of chicken broth. I could see the faint stain where the soup had spilled. The tile slightly darker, no matter how many times I scrubbed it. I thought about packing my things. It wouldn't be hard. I didn't own much. A few clothes, my photo albums, a handful of books. But when I went to the closet to get my suitcase, I saw the folder that held the house deed. My name and Ethan's were printed side by side. I remembered the day I added his name to it. The lawyer saying it would make things easier for him later. I hadn't thought then that it would make it harder for me to leave. The house was as much mine as his. Yet somehow, I was the one who no longer felt welcome in it. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning. It was something to do. Something to keep my hands from shaking. Every so often, I would hear a car outside and think maybe Ethan had come home early. He didn't. Around noon, There was a knock on the back door. It was Clarice, my neighbor. She stood there in her old cardigan, holding a small jar of homemade jam. She had that calm look she always carried, the kind that made you feel like you couldn't hide anything from her. I smiled, but it felt weak. "Hi, Clarice." "Hi yourself," she said. "I was just making lunch and thought you might want some jam for your toast." That was her way of checking in without asking directly. I opened the door wider. "Come in." She stepped inside and placed the jar on the counter. Her eyes lingered on my arm, where the skin was red and blotchy. "What happened?" I pulled my sleeve down. "Oh, this just spilled some soup last night. I'm fine." Clarice didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at me, then at the kitchen floor, the faint stains near the stove. "Finally," she said softly. "Accidents happen, but some shouldn't." Her words hit something deep inside me. I tried to change the subject. "How's your garden doing?" She smiled, but her eyes were still sharp. "The roses are good. The rain helps." Then she turned toward the window, the same one that faced my kitchen. Her voice was quieter when she said, "I heard some noise last night. Sounded like shouting." I froze. I didn't know what to say. She didn't press me. Instead, she reached for her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a printed photo. "I didn't mean to take it," she said quickly. My camera was on the table. I saw movement and instinctively snapped a picture. She slid the photo across the counter. It was blurry but clear enough. My back against the cabinet. Soup on the floor. Savannah's arm raised. My stomach turned. Clarice touched my hand. "You don't have to do anything with it. But if you ever need to, I want you to know I have your back." I couldn't find my voice. All I could do was nod. She left soon after, the jar of jam still unopened on the counter. I stood there for a long time, staring at the photo. 1,000 thoughts spun through my head. Shame. Fear. Relief. Relief that someone knew. Fear of what Savannah would do if she found out. That evening, Savannah came home late. She walked straight past me, tossed her bag on the counter, and started scrolling through her phone. She didn't even glance at me. I wanted to ask if Ethan had called her, if they had talked about what happened, but I stayed quiet. After dinner, I washed the dishes while she sat on the couch watching TV. My arm stung each time the warm water touched it. When I finished, I went to my room and closed the door. I took the house deed out again, running my fingers over the paper. I had once been proud to share it with Ethan. Now it felt like a chain. Outside, the neighborhood lights blinked through my curtain. I could see Clarice's house across the fence. Her living room lamp was still on. I wondered if she was looking this way too. The phone buzzed. A notification from Facebook popped up on my screen. I didn't pay attention at first, but the preview caught my eye. A post in a local group called Beaverton Community Watch. It was Clarice's neighborhood group. I clicked on it without thinking. There was a photo. My kitchen. My fall. The caption read, "Elder abuse is real. Look out for one another." My breath caught in my throat. The comments were pouring in. People angry, horrified, some asking who it was. No names yet. But the post was spreading. I closed my phone, heart pounding. I sat there, the photo still in my hand from earlier, the glow of my phone fading on the dresser. Somebody had seen. Somebody cared. But I didn't know yet that this picture, this one blurry image from a quiet neighborhood, was about to turn my entire life upside down. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I thought it was just another spam alert. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw dozens of notifications, messages from neighbors I barely knew, names I hadn't seen in years. My heart thudded as I opened one. "Margaret. Is this you? Are you okay?" I didn't understand at first. Then I clicked the link. The photo filled the screen. Sharper now than the printed one Clarice had given me. Me on the kitchen floor. Soup spilled across the tile. Savannah's face twisted in anger. My breath caught. The caption was the same as I had seen last night. But now it had thousands of shares. Elder abuse is real. The comments scrolled endlessly. Strangers demanding justice. Tagging local news pages. Asking for the names of the people involved. My face was everywhere. Savannah came downstairs still wearing her robe. Hair tied in a messy bun. She had her phone in hand too. Scrolling fast. She stopped suddenly. Staring at the screen. And I could see the color drain from her face. She turned to me. Her voice sharp. "What is this?" I swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say. She marched closer. Shoving the phone toward my face. "Did you post this? Did you send this to someone?" "No." She laughed. A harsh, disbelieving sound. "Then who did?" Before I could answer, Ethan walked in. Already tense. He looked from her to me. Confused. "What's going on?" Savannah shoved the phone at him. "That's what's going on. Your mother's on the internet." He looked down. His eyes widening. His voice dropped. Oh my God. I felt like a ghost watching someone else's life fall apart. My hands were cold. My knees weak. Ethan turned to me. "Mom. What happened? Who took this?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I didn't even know it was online." Savannah wasn't listening. She was pacing the kitchen, muttering, "This is going to ruin me. You don't understand. Ethan. My clients follow me. My sponsors. If they see this, I'm done." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "We'll fix it. We'll figure out who posted it." Savannah glared at me. "Don't look at me like that. You wanted this. Didn't you? You've been jealous from the start." Jealous. I felt something rise in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. My voice was quiet but steady. "Of what?" "Savannah. Of being treated like a burden in my own home." Ethan tried to step between us. "Stop. Both of you." Savannah's voice cracked. "You think this is about respect. This is about my reputation." She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Ethan stood by the counter, staring down at the floor. He looked years older than he had yesterday. He whispered, "What are we going to do?" I didn't answer. Because deep down, I knew there was nothing to do. Once something hits the internet, it doesn't disappear. By noon, local community pages were posting about the photo. Then came a call from someone named Brenda Lopez. She said she was a reporter from Channel 7 News in Portland. She wanted to verify the story. I almost hung up. But her voice was calm. "Kind. Mrs. Whitmore. I just want to make sure you're safe." I told her I was fine. She asked if I'd be willing to talk on record. I said no. The idea of my name on television made me sick. Still, the world kept spinning without my permission. By evening, the story had been picked up by online blogs. People were trying to guess where it had happened, who the woman in the photo was. I saw my own curtains in one of the background shots and knew it wouldn't stay anonymous for long. When Ethan got home that night, he looked pale. He dropped his keys on the table and said, "Mom, everyone at work saw it." I said nothing. He sat down heavily, staring at his hands. "Savannah's in trouble. The agency called. They're investigating her." I took a breath, steadying myself. Maybe that's for the best. Hay looked up, shocked. "Mom, she's my wife. And I'm your mother." He opened his mouth, then shut it. His jaw clenched, eyes wet. The front door opened. Savannah was back, her face red from crying. She threw her phone onto the couch. "They're calling me a monster," she said, voice shaking. "Do you understand I'm getting death threats?" Ethan tried to comfort her, but she shoved him away. This is your fault. Margaret, you couldn't keep your mouth shut. I stood still, my heart pounding. I didn't post it. Then who did? I thought of Clarice but said nothing. I wasn't going to give her up. Savannah's eyes narrowed. You're lying. She took a step forward, then stopped when Ethan grabbed her arm. That's enough. Sav. She pulled free. I can't live like this. Not with her here. Ethan didn't respond. His silence said everything. Savannah went upstairs, slamming the door again. I sank into a chair, feeling small and tired. The house was no longer mine, no longer safe. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number. It read, I'm the one who sent the photo to the reporter. You don't need to thank me. Just know people care. No name. But I knew who it was. Clarice. I sat there in the dim light, reading it over and over. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, I opened the front door to get the paper, and a white van was parked across the street. A logo on the side read Channel 7 News. A woman in a blazer stood beside it, holding a microphone. She looked straight at my house. It had begun. The reporter lifted a hand like someone waving to a friend and started across the street. I stood there with the newspaper still tucked under my arm and felt a small tremor run through me. The front yard suddenly looked too exposed, the shrubs too thin, my nightgown too bright in the gray morning. She stopped at the walkway and introduced herself as Brenda Lopez from Channel 7 News in Portland. She said she wanted to check on me first and foremost. Her voice was steady, her eyes kind in a way that made me brace for tears. I told her I was fine and heard how unconvincing it sounded. She asked if we could talk inside. I hesitated, then opened the door and led her to the kitchen because that was where all of this had started. And because there is no hiding a kitchen. She took in the stove, the mended bowl on the counter, the faint stain on the tile that would not let go. She said she understood this was difficult and that we could keep anything off the record until I felt ready. She asked if I felt safe. I said yes. Then no. Then that I was not sure anymore. She did not rush me. She took out a small notebook and a card with her name. She slid the card toward me and told me to call or text any time, even if it was the middle of the night. I asked what would happen if I spoke on camera. She said the truth has a way of steadying the ground under your feet, even when it shakes everything else. She added that they could blur faces. They could keep details private. That I was in control of what I chose to share. I looked at the window where the morning light fell across the sink. I thought of Savannah and her camera, of how everything about her life was curated and bright and final. I told Brenda I was not ready to be on television. She nodded, as if she had expected that. We were still sitting at the table when the garage door rattled and Ethan stepped in from the mudroom. He froze when he saw Brenda. He asked who she was, though he already knew. I said, "This is Brenda. She came to check on me." He stiffened and said we were not giving any interviews. Brenda kept her voice even. She said she was here to make sure his mother was safe, and that she would leave her number. Ethan glanced at the stain on the floor and then at me, and something in his face gave way. He said he needed to call Savannah and ask her to come home. Brenda stood and said she would see herself out. At the door, she told me again to call if I needed anything, even just to talk. The house felt cold after she left, like the moment a storm pulls away and the air rushes in behind it. Ethan stood by the sink with his hands braced on the counter. He asked why I had let a reporter inside. I told him she knocked and I opened the door. He said people at work were already whispering. He said we should handle this privately. I asked him how exactly we were supposed to do that when half the city had seen the photo. He did not have an answer. Savannah came home around lunch. She walked in fast, sunglasses on, though the sky had no sun in it. She asked why there had been a news van out front. Ethan told her a reporter stopped by and that I had spoken with her. That was not true. But he said it anyway. And Savannah's eyes flashed like struck metal. She said I was determined to ruin her life. She said her clients had been calling all morning and that her agent was demanding a statement. She said I needed to go online and say it was an accident. She said I needed to say I overreacted. She said I needed to fix it. I told her I would not lie. She asked if I knew how much money she stood to lose if this kept spreading. I thought of my pension and the careful way I used to fold grocery coupons, and how no amount of money ever made it easier to sleep when you felt unwanted in your own home. I told her this was not about money. She laughed without humor and said everything was about money and image and how people saw you. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder and told her to sit down. She shrugged him off. She said she would draft a statement for me to post, and that if I did not post it, she would ask her lawyer what she could do to have me removed from the house. I reminded her the house was mine and Ethan's. She said the internet did not care about deeds or history, only about the last headline. She said this would end with all of us on the street if I did not cooperate. I felt something new then. A thin wire of anger running under my skin. Steady and quiet. I told her I would not be bullied in my kitchen. Ethan asked both of us to calm down. Savannah said she would not calm down while her name burned. Then she grabbed her bag and said she was going to the agency to handle damage control. On her way out, she paused at the door and told me to remember that nothing on the internet lasts if you starve it of attention. Then she left, slamming the door like a period. The afternoon stretched long and colorless. I made tea and did not drink it. I watered the fern that never seemed to thrive in this light. I took the laundry out of the dryer and folded it twice, because once did not fill enough time. Ethan moved through the house like a man trying not to make noise in a museum. He opened his laptop and opened, then closed the same email 3 times. He looked at me and away again. At one point, he said he did not know how things had gotten like this. I wanted to tell him it had been getting like this for a long time. I wanted to say it started with small corrections in size, and the way a person begins to speak for you, as if you are a piece of furniture. Instead, I told him I was tired and went to my room for a while. When I came back out, the sky had gone lavender. It was that soft edge between day and night that always made me think of putting dinner on the table when Ethan was little. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find Brenda on the porch again. This time, without the van or the cameraman. She said she was off the clock and only wanted to drop off a list of resources. She held out a folder. Inside were numbers for a senior advocacy group, a legal aid organization, and a support hotline. She said sometimes the hardest part was deciding to tell someone, even if that someone was a stranger on the other end of a phone. I thanked her. She said she would not stay, but then glanced past me into the house and lowered her voice. She said a source in her newsroom told her that a national site was about to pick up the story. She said things might move quickly, and that it was better to have help lined up before they did. I felt my shoulders straighten, as if my spine remembered how to hold me up. I told her I understood. She said good and smiled. And for a second, I almost reached for her hand. After she left, I walked to the sink and ran a glass of water. Through the window, I could see Clarice in her yard clipping dead blooms off a rose bush. Her posture patient and precise. She looked up, and our eyes met. She lifted the clippers in a little salute. I nodded back. And the simple gesture was like a thread thrown across a gap. Something to hold on to. Ethan came into the kitchen and asked if that was the reporter again. I said yes, and told him she had left some numbers. He asked if I planned to call any of them. I told him I did not know, but that it felt better to have them. He said he wished none of this had happened. I said me too. And I meant it. Night settled. The house creaked in the way old houses do. Familiar and restless. Savannah did not come home for dinner. Ethan reheated leftovers and ate them standing up, as if sitting would make him feel the weight of the chair. He asked if I wanted some. I said no and made myself a slice of toast with the jam Clarice had brought. It tasted of summer and patience. Later, alone in the living room, I scrolled through the comments again. Even though I had promised myself I would stop. There were cruel ones. Because there always are. But there were more that were gentle. People wrote that their mothers had gone through something similar. People wrote that seeing the photo made them call someone they had not called in a long time. One woman wrote that she had been a nurse for 30 years and that she believed me. Even if I never said a word on television. I set the phone down and listened to the clock tick. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and then grew quiet. Headlights swept across the ceiling as a car turned the corner and disappeared. Before bed, I put Brenda's folder in the drawer with the house deed. Paper against paper. One kind of proof beside another. I stood there for a while. My hand flat on the wood. Feeling my pulse under my skin. I thought of the stain on the tile. The one that refused to fade. And felt a stubborn kind of comfort. Not everything can be scrubbed away to make a story pretty. Some marks are meant to stay until someone asks what happened. I turned off the lamp and the house breathed around me. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. For now, there was quiet. And the soft sound of rain beginning against the eaves. Rain tapped the gutters through the night, and by morning the sky hung low, and the house felt like it was waiting for something. I had just set the kettle on when a firm knock sounded at the front door. Ethan looked up from his laptop at the table. Savannah was still upstairs. The second knock came. Steady and official. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to answer it. A tall man stood on the porch with a windbreaker and a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Officer Daniels from the Washington County Sheriff's Office. He said they had received a welfare check request through a senior protection line and asked if he could come in to speak with me. His voice was calm in the way of people who walk into other people's storms for a living. I stepped back and let him inside. Ethan hovered in the doorway to the kitchen. Daniels glanced toward him and then asked if he could speak with me alone for a moment. Ethan hesitated, then went to the sink and turned on the water like he suddenly had dishes to rinse. Daniels and I sat at the kitchen table. He asked if I felt safe in the home. I told him I was not sure anymore. He asked if there had been an incident involving me and a family member. I said there had. He asked if I had any injuries. I rolled my sleeve to show the red patches where the soup had burned my forearm. He looked closely, not touching, and asked about my head or neck. I told him my scalp was tender and I had bruising at my shoulder from hitting the cabinet. He took notes on a small pad. He asked if there was video or photo evidence. I thought of the stain on the tile. The photo printed on plain paper. The way Clarice had slid it across my counter like a lifeline. I told him a neighbor might have something. Right then, a knock sounded at the back door. I stood and opened it, and there was Clarice in her old cardigan. The same envelope in her hand. She said she saw the patrol car and thought she should come over. Her eyes moved to the officer and then to me for permission. I nodded. She stepped in and greeted Daniels with the quiet firmness of someone who knows exactly why she is there. She pulled out the printed photo and a tiny USB drive and placed both on the table. She said the photo was taken through her window and the clip was from her porch camera that records audio near the fence line. She added that she would not share them with anyone without my consent. Daniels thanked her and asked if he could view the clip on his device. He watched for a minute with his brows drawn, then stopped and wrote down the timestamp. He asked me if I needed medical attention. I told him I did not. He asked if there were any firearms in the house. I said no. Footsteps pounded down the stairs. Savannah came into the kitchen in leggings and a sweatshirt. Hair piled high. Face set. She stopped short when she saw the officer. She asked what was going on and why a cop was in her kitchen. Daniel stood and introduced himself. He said he was here on a welfare check. Savannah laughed under her breath and said there had been a minor accident while filming and that I was fine. She said this had already gotten out of hand online and we needed privacy. Not more drama. Daniels did not rise to it. He said his job was to ensure everyone's safety and to document what had happened. He asked her to sit. She did not. She said he had no right to be here without a warrant. He replied that he had been invited inside and that a welfare check did not require a warrant. He said again that he would like to finish his questions. Ethan drifted back to the doorway. Towel still in his hand. Eyes on the floor. Savannah paced between the island and the sink like a caged thing. She said the internet was a cesspool and that people were taking a single frame out of context. She said I had slipped. That I was unsteady these days. Her words hung in the air. Sour and careless. Daniels looked at me. Not at her. He asked if I agreed with that version. I said I did not. He wrote another line on his pad. Then he addressed both of them. He said that based on the visible injuries and the evidence provided by a neighbor, he would be making a mandatory report to Adult Protective Services. He said an investigator would follow up and that I would be contacted by a victim's advocate to go over resources and options. He added that while the investigation was ongoing, he strongly recommended a separation period to de-escalate tensions in the home. Savannah crossed her arms. She asked what that meant. Daniel said that the safest option was for her to stay elsewhere for 48 hours while statements were gathered. He said he would also be documenting an instruction to refrain from any live streaming or filming inside the home during that period to prevent further escalation and to protect privacy. He said failure to comply could become part of the report. Savannah sputtered that this was absurd. She said her work depended on filming in the house. Daniels told her that work could continue at a different location for 2 days. He said the priority right now was safety. Ethan finally spoke. He asked if Savannah could stay at her friend Kayla's place for a couple nights. Savannah spun toward him. She asked whose side he was on. Ethan did not answer. His hands were trembling at his sides. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. Daniels asked me if I had a safe place to go if needed. I said Clarice lived next door and that I could stay with her in a pinch. Clarice nodded and said the guest room was ready and that she already had clean sheets on the bed. I wanted to hug her and also to hide behind her all at once. Savannah grabbed her phone and started tapping furiously. She said she would be contacting an attorney and that this was a gross overreach. Daniel said she was welcome to seek counsel and reminded her again about the separation recommendation and the instruction on filming. He asked for her phone number and email for the report. She gave them with clipped syllables that sounded like doors slamming. He turned back to me and explained in even tones what would happen next. A caseworker would call. I could request a protective order if I chose. If at any point I felt threatened or unsafe, I should call right away. Even if it felt small. He placed a printed card on the table with numbers for Adult Protective Services and his own department's non-emergency line. Then he asked if I had any questions. I asked how long these things usually take. He said it varies. But that starting the process was the hardest part for most people. He said I had done that. When he left, the house seemed to exhale in a way that made the walls feel tired. Savannah stood rigid by the island. Thumbs flying as she texted. Ethan sank into a chair and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. I sat too, suddenly aware of the cold spot where the morning light had slid away from the floor. Savannah broke the quiet first. She said I had humiliated her and that stepping out of the house for 2 days would only feed the story. She said if my goal was to destroy her career, I was doing a fine job. I told her my goal was to be safe in my own kitchen. She rolled her eyes and said I was dramatic. She grabbed a tote from the pantry and began shoving things into it with sharp movements. Makeup bag. 2 sweaters. A ring light that shouldn't have fit, but somehow did. Ethan stood and offered to drive her. She told him not to bother. She said she would take a ride share. At the door, she paused and told me I had no idea what I had started. Then she left. The tote banging against the doorframe on the way out. The house quieted. The clock over the stove clicked as it settled back into its tick. Ethan washed his face at the sink and dried it with the same towel he'd been holding all morning. He said he would call his boss and take the rest of the day. He asked if I wanted him to stay. I told him I would be fine. He nodded. then looked at me as if there were 1,000 things he might say, and none of them would make sense, waved into the air between us. After he went upstairs, I stepped outside into the damp yard. The rain had rinsed everything to a dull shine. Clarisse opened her back door, as if she had been waiting for the sound of mine. She asked how it went. I told her the officer was kind, and that he took the photo and the clip for the report. I told her there would be a follow-up. She said good and asked if I wanted to come over for tea. I said maybe later. I said I wanted to sit for a minute in the air. I stayed on the patio for a long time, watching the cedar branches drip, listening to the distant traffic on the main road. The anger inside me had cooled into something steadier, a weight I could hold without dropping. I thought about the card in my kitchen drawer with the numbers on it. I thought about Brenda's folder beside the deed. Paper against paper. Proof against history. When I finally went back inside, the light had shifted again. Ethan had come down and left a note on the table saying he was going to check on Savannah and would be back before dinner. I set the kettle on once more and waited for the click. The little bubble of steam between metal and flame felt oddly reassuring, like a signal that some things still worked the way they were supposed to. The kettle began to hum. I turned off the burner and stood with my hands around the warm pot without pouring, listening to the house breathe and settle as if it too were learning how to be quiet without anyone filming it. That night, the rain finally stopped, but the quiet it left behind felt heavier than the storm. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house made my heart twitch. Pipes settling, branches brushing the siding, the faint hum of the refrigerator. It all felt louder than it should. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the street lamp slicing through the blinds. By morning, the house smelled of stale coffee and something metallic. Ethan hadn't come home yet. His note from the day before still sat on the counter, the ink slightly smudged where a drop of water had fallen. I made tea but barely drank it. My stomach felt knotted. Half fear, half exhaustion. Around 9. My phone buzzed. A new message. It was from an unknown number. Mrs. Whitmore. This is Karen from Adult Protective Services. I'm reaching out regarding your recent welfare report. Please call me when you're ready. Seeing it in writing made everything more real than I was ready for. I sat at the table, staring at the message until the phone dimmed. Then I pressed call before I could change my mind. Karen's voice was steady and warm, the kind that sounded like she'd spoken to hundreds of frightened people before. She explained that she would be stopping by later that morning to go over next steps. She said I didn't need to prepare anything. Just to be honest, that last part scared me the most. When the knock came, I was still tidying the living room, picking up old magazines I didn't even read. Karen was in her 40s, with short blonde hair and a navy blazer that somehow didn't wrinkle. She smiled, soft but sure. She said she wouldn't take much of my time. She took out a notepad and started with small questions. How long I'd lived in the house, whether I had other family nearby, if I felt safe at home. That word again. Safe. It sounded simple, but I didn't even know what it meant anymore. When I told her what had happened that night with Savannah, she didn't flinch. She wrote quickly, then asked if there had been other incidents. My throat tightened. I told her about the shouting, the way Savannah treated me like an inconvenience, the things Ethan didn't see or didn't want to see. Karen nodded and said that kind of behavior was abuse too, even without bruises. I hadn't thought of it that way. It felt strange hearing someone else name it out loud. After an hour, she closed her notebook and said they would open a case file. She said I could file for an emergency protective order if I wanted. I asked what that meant, and she explained that it would prevent Savannah from returning home for a period of time. The idea made my chest both lighter and tighter at once. I said I needed to think about it. When she left, I walked her to the door. Clarisse was standing outside by her mailbox, pretending to sort envelopes. She gave me a little wave. Karen noticed her and smiled politely before leaving. Clarisse crossed the yard once the car pulled away. She asked how it went. I told her they were opening a case and might issue a protective order. Clarisse looked relieved. She said it was about time someone stepped in. Then she handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a loaf of banana bread. She said she thought I could use something warm. I could have cried. We sat in the kitchen, eating slices of bread with butter. The kind of quiet that felt companionable. She asked if Ethan had called. I said no. She said not to blame myself for any of this. I told her that was easier said than done. By afternoon, the house felt too empty. I checked my phone again. No messages. The internet, though, was still very much alive. My story had spread to national outlets now. Some had blurred my face. Others hadn't. I saw headlines that made me sound like a headline myself. Elderly woman assaulted, during livestream influencer wife, under investigation for abuse. It felt surreal. Reading about myself like I was someone else's tragedy. There were comments too. Some kind. Some cruel. A few calling me brave. More calling me names. I stopped reading when one said I probably made it up for attention. The cruelty of strangers was a different kind of bruise. Around 4. Ethan came home. His hair was unkempt. Tie gone. Eyes shadowed. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He said Savannah wasn't taking things well. Her agency had suspended her partnerships. Sponsors had pulled out. She was staying with a friend but threatening to sue everyone, including the news outlets. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He said she might sue me too. I asked what for. He said, defamation. Slander. Public humiliation. I laughed before I could stop myself. It wasn't a happy laugh. More like something broken escaping. I told him she didn't need to worry about me ruining her reputation. She did that herself when she grabbed me and threw me down in front of a camera. He winced. He said I didn't understand how much pressure she was under. That the internet had turned her into a villain overnight. I told him pressure didn't excuse cruelty. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat down at the table. Elbows on his knees. Head in his hands. For the first time, he looked small again. Like the boy I used to comfort after nightmares. He asked if I hated him. I said I didn't. I said I was just tired. He nodded. And for a long time neither of us spoke. That night, I couldn't bring myself to cook. Ethan ordered pizza. And we ate it quietly in the living room, like strangers who used to know each other. Afterward, he said he needed to go to the office early the next morning to meet with his supervisor. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. When he went upstairs, I sat alone for a while. Scrolling through my phone again, this time I saw something new. A short video clip uploaded by Channel 7. Brenda's voice narrating. Images of me blurred. Clarisse's fence visible in the background. She talked about the broader issue of elder abuse. How often it went unseen until someone was brave enough to speak. I didn't remember agreeing to it. But I didn't feel angry. It was careful. Respectful. And it wasn't about shame. It was about truth. At the end, Brenda said authorities had confirmed an investigation was underway, and that no charges had yet been filed. Then she said something that stayed with me. Justice begins quietly, she said, with one person deciding not to be silent anymore. I turned off the phone and sat in the dark. The words echoing in my head. Justice begins quietly. Maybe it did. Maybe it was starting here. In this house. In this silence that finally felt like mine. When I finally stood, I walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer. Brenda's folder was still there beside the deed. I took it out. Looked at the hotline numbers again. Then wrote down Karen's name and the date she had come. I slipped the note inside. Like a record of something real. Something that couldn't be undone. The house was still when I went to bed. No shouting. No footsteps pacing overhead. Just the sound of rain starting again. Soft against the windows. I pulled the blanket tighter and let it wash over me. Not as fear this time. but as something almost like peace. Morning came quietly. The kind of gray light that makes it hard to tell if it's dawn or just another overcast day. I woke up before my alarm, lying still for a while, listening to the drip of rain against the gutter. It had been days since Savannah left, and the house felt both peaceful and hollow. Ethan had gone to work early, leaving a note that said he'd be home late. The empty space on the counter where her blender used to sit felt almost sacred. I made coffee and watched the steam curl upward. The kitchen still carried faint scars of what had happened, but it was cleaner now. Calmer. I opened the window a little, letting in the smell of wet cedar. The air felt cold but alive. At mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. I half expected it to be another reporter, but it was Brenda Lopez again, wearing jeans and a rain jacket this time, instead of her blazer. She smiled when I opened the door. She said she was off duty but thought I might want an update. I let her in. She sat at the table, glancing around the house. She said Adult Protective Services had confirmed their investigation and that Savannah's agency had been contacted as well. Then she looked at me carefully and said, "You did the right thing, Mrs. Whitmore." I told her I wasn't sure it felt right. She nodded as if she understood. "It never does at first," she said. Then she asked if Ethan had been in touch with his wife. I said yes, and that he looked lost. Brenda said that's what happens when control slips away. She said, sometimes it takes losing everything for people to see who they really are. Before leaving, she handed me a sealed envelope. She said it was from a lawyer representing a local victims support organization, and that they wanted to help me set up a statement in case the case went to court. I hesitated. Court sounded final. Heavy. Brenda smiled gently and said it wasn't a trial, just a chance to make my voice official. After she left, I sat staring at the envelope. I thought about all the years I'd kept quiet, about how my silence had felt like safety, but was really a slow kind of suffocation. Then I thought of Clarice. I slipped on my coat and went next door. Clarice opened the door before I even knocked. She must have seen me coming from the window. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and apples. She poured tea without asking. I showed her the envelope. She read the letter and nodded. She said she had a friend named Evelyn who worked for a legal aid nonprofit in Portland and that she could call her if I wanted a second opinion. I said yes. We sat at her table while she dialed the number on speaker. A woman's voice came through, calm and quick, introducing herself as Evelyn Brooks. Clarice gave her a short summary, then handed me the phone. Evelyn's voice was smooth but kind. She said she could help me file a statement to make sure my side of the story was protected. She also said something that surprised me. She said, "If your daughter-in-law decides to sue you, her claims will collapse under the weight of that video evidence. You have nothing to fear from the truth." I thanked her. She said she would send over a form for me to sign electronically and that she'd handle the rest. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. Clarice poured more tea, and neither of us spoke. The steam rose between us like a fragile truce. That evening, Ethan came home looking exhausted. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and rubbed his temples. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said he'd already eaten. Then he sat at the table across from me, his face pale. He said Savannah had called him crying. She'd been questioned by investigators, and one of her sponsors had canceled her contract completely. She said she was thinking of leaving town for a while. Ethan said she'd asked him to go with her, to start over somewhere new. Then he looked up at me. He said he didn't know what to do. I told him that was something he needed to figure out on his own. He said he felt like he was losing everything. I said maybe he was losing the things he was never meant to keep. He didn't answer. He sat there quietly, and I could see how tired he was. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to remind him that I was still his mother, but I didn't. The space between us felt too full of everything we hadn't said. Later that night, I heard him talking on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, but I caught fragments. Words like leave, charges, settlement, then silence. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and the sky had opened into a soft blue. Clarice came by with a casserole, saying she'd made too much for one person. While we were talking, my phone rang. It was Evelyn. She said she'd filed my statement and that the police would probably contact me soon to arrange an official interview. Then she said something unexpected. Apparently, during the investigation, they had uncovered evidence of financial irregularities in Ethan's accounts. Transfers, she said, made from my pension fund to his joint business with Savannah. My pulse quickened. I told her I hadn't touched my account in years, that Ethan had handled it. She said that matched what the bank records showed. After the call, I sat still for a long time. Clarice asked what was wrong. I told her everything. She frowned, then said quietly that maybe this was bigger than any of us thought. That evening, Ethan came home looking nervous. He said the police had been in touch with him, asking about the company funds. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to help manage my money safely. I said nothing. He asked if I believed him. I said I didn't know anymore. His face fell. He said I didn't understand what it was like to have everything crumble. I said, maybe now he did. He stood there for a moment, then said softly that Savannah had left for Los Angeles that morning. She hadn't told him until after she landed. I didn't say anything. When he finally went upstairs, I walked into the kitchen. The window was dark, reflecting my own face back at me. I didn't look like the woman I used to be. I looked steadier, older maybe, but unshaken. I took out the envelope Evelyn had sent me and placed it beside Brenda's folder in the drawer. The paper felt like armor. For years I had let others speak for me, manage me, contain me. Now, for the first time, I had words written in my own defense. Outside, I could see the faint glow from Clarice's house again. Her curtains were open, and I saw her reading under the yellow lamplight. Her cat curled at her feet. I whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular, then turned off my own lights and let the house settle around me. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. The morning light crept through the blinds, soft and pale, touching everything in the kitchen like it was afraid to wake me. I sat at the table with my second cup of coffee, watching the steam drift and fade. Ethan's car was gone, and his note on the counter said he'd be handling things at the bank. I didn't know whether that meant fixing the mess or covering it. Either way, I didn't ask. By 10, my phone buzzed again. It was Evelyn, my lawyer. She said the detectives had traced several unauthorized transfers from my account into a business venture under Savannah's name. The money had been moved gradually. Small sums that looked harmless on their own, but added up to more than $30,000 over 3 years. My heart sank as I listened. Evelyn said the investigators were taking it seriously, that fraud involving a vulnerable adult could lead to felony charges. Vulnerable adult. I hated that phrase. I wasn't helpless, just too trusting. I hung up and sat in silence. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. The house kept pretending nothing had changed, but everything had. Around noon, Clarice knocked. She was holding her umbrella, though the rain had already stopped. She looked at me and didn't even ask before stepping inside. She said she'd seen a car parked down the street that looked like one of those unmarked police vehicles. She asked if I was expecting a visit. I told her maybe. Then I told her about the money. Her jaw tightened. She said she'd known something wasn't right about the way Savannah always talked about managing investments. We sat at the table together, the same one where everything seemed to happen now. I told her part of me still wanted to believe Ethan hadn't known. She said maybe he hadn't at first, but he had known long enough to say nothing. That hurt because she was right. Not long after she left, the phone rang again. This time it was Officer Daniels. His voice was steady, but less formal than before. He said they were looking into the financial side and might need to interview both me and Ethan. I said I'd cooperate fully. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that the district attorney's office was reviewing possible charges against Savannah for elder abuse and assault. I felt something inside me unclench a little. Justice was slow, but it was moving. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home early. His face looked drawn, like he hadn't slept. He said he'd met with the bank manager, and they had confirmed everything. Savannah had used his login to access my account. He said he hadn't known until it was too late. I wanted to believe him, but part of me couldn't. He sat across from me, rubbing his hands together. He said the business was gone, the account frozen, the investors pulling out. He said he'd lost his job that morning. He laughed bitterly. Said it was ironic how quickly everything could fall apart. I told him maybe things were falling apart because they needed to. He didn't answer. We sat in silence until the doorbell rang. When I opened it, it was Brenda again. Her camera crew, waiting in the van outside. She smiled politely. Her tone, careful. She said they were doing a follow-up for the Channel 7 segment and wanted to know if I'd consider speaking on record this time. I hesitated, but something in me said yes, before my fear could say no. We set up in the living room. Brenda placed the small microphone on my collar. Her assistant adjusted the camera. And for the first time, I looked into a lens, not as someone's background character, but as myself. Brenda asked if I wanted to talk about what had happened. I told her I didn't want to focus on pain, only on what silence costs. I spoke about the moment I realized that love and loyalty can become chains when you're too afraid to break them. About how I'd thought keeping peace was the same as keeping family. About how I had mistaken endurance for strength. Brenda listened quietly, never interrupting. When we finished, she said she'd make sure the piece was respectful. I believed her. She asked if she could include Clarice's photo of that night. I nodded. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was truth. After the crew left, I stood at the window watching their van pull away. The reflection of my own face stared back at me. Older. Yes. But also steadier. For the first time in months, I didn't look like a ghost in my own house. That night, Ethan came downstairs while I was washing dishes. He said he'd seen the camera van leaving and asked if I'd given another interview. I said yes. He didn't look angry, just defeated. He said the story would ruin any chance of him getting rehired. I said maybe it would also remind him who he wanted to be. He sighed, leaned on the counter, and said he didn't deserve forgiveness. I told him forgiveness wasn't something to deserve. It was something to earn. Then I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. The next morning, the phone started ringing before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. Brenda's segment had aired overnight. I hadn't expected it to spread so fast. But by sunrise, the story was on national networks. People were sharing clips online, using a hashtag she'd created, the Soup Mom. At first, I hated the nickname. It felt like a label I hadn't asked for. But then I saw the comments from strangers, women my age, women older, even young mothers writing about their own experiences of being dismissed, silenced, or made to feel invisible. Some said they saw their own mothers in me. Others said they'd shown their daughters the video so they'd understand what respect looks like. It overwhelmed me. I cried quietly at the kitchen table while reading message after message from people thanking me for speaking up. Later that day, Brenda called again. She said the station had received thousands of responses and that advocacy groups were reaching out to partner for a campaign. She asked if I would consider joining one of their town halls. I said I'd think about it. She said, "You already started something, Mrs. Whitmore. You might as well see where it goes." By evening, the phone still hadn't stopped ringing. A church in Salem wanted me to speak at a community meeting. A senior rights group in Eugene wanted to feature me in their newsletter. Even a small podcast in Idaho had emailed asking for an interview. Ethan sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, watching everything unfold. At one point, he said softly, "They're calling you a hero." "Mom," I shook my head. I said I wasn't a hero. I was just tired of pretending everything was fine. He looked at me for a long moment, then said he wished he'd been brave sooner. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house quietly, turning off lights, touching the edges of furniture like I was relearning the shape of my own home. I paused at the kitchen window. Clarice's light was still on next door. She must have been watching the same news. I whispered a small thank you to her, to Brenda, to whoever had decided that the truth mattered enough to be seen. Then I turned away from the window and sat down at the table one last time. The house silent, except for the steady rhythm of the clock. The noise of the world could wait until morning. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, the quiet belonged to me. Morning brought a sky, the color of dishwater, and a chill that crept through the windows. I wrapped my robe tighter and waited for the kettle to sing. The house felt still in a way that no longer frightened me. It felt like a held breath that belonged to me. By 8, Clarice tapped at the back door with the soft insistence of someone who knows you are awake. She had a folder under her arm, and the look she wears when she means business. She said she had received 3 messages overnight from accounts she did not recognize. They told her to take down the photo. Said they knew where she lived. Said she would be sorry. She set her phone on the table and scrolled through the threats with steady hands. I watched her face while she watched the screen. There was fear there, but also a kind of quiet anger that I had come to admire. She said she had already emailed Officer Daniels, and the screenshots were attached. I poured coffee for both of us and felt my hands steady as I set the cups down. We sat together and listened to the clock until my phone buzzed. It was Daniels. He said a detective from the cyber unit was on the way to Clarice's house and asked if I could step over when they arrived. I told him I would be there. The detective was a compact woman with a canvas tote and a quick, careful way of moving. She asked Clarice for permission to image her phone and copy the messages. She spoke in simple sentences without jargon and explained what she was doing. She said they would subpoena platform data and look for connection points. She said everything leaves a trail, even when people think it does not. Clarice nodded and handed over the phone like a person passing a heavy box to someone stronger. While the detective worked, Daniels stood in Clarice's kitchen with a notepad. He asked me to describe any other harassment I had received. I told him about the comments that called me names and said I was making it up for attention. But I said those felt like noise. The targeted messages to Clarice felt different. They were not just ugly. They were meant to shut her up. Daniels said they took that seriously. By late morning, the detective looked up from her laptop and said they had a common thread. Several of the accounts had been created with the same recovery number. She said it traced back to a phone registered to Savannah. I felt the room tilt a fraction and then settle. Clarice let out a breath that sounded like she had been holding it all morning. Daniels asked the detective to send the findings to the district attorney's office and said he would be requesting a warrant. He turned to me and said, "This part would move quickly." He said, I did not need to be present. I said I would stay next door with Clarice. He nodded and told us both to keep our phones close. The officers left, and Clarice sat beside me at her small table. She put her hand on top of mine. The house smelled like lemon oil and clean paper. We did not talk much. Sometimes, silence is the only thing that fits. Not an hour later, we heard the sound of cars braking in front of my house. Through the blinds, we saw 2 cruisers and an unmarked sedan. The doors opened, and men and women in jackets stepped out with that professional purpose that makes neighbors gather at their windows. Clarice squeezed my hand. We stayed where we were. I watched from the side yard as they knocked. The door opened. Savannah stood there in black leggings and a sweatshirt, hair in a high knot, face bare. Even from a distance, I could see her eyes go hard when she recognized Officer Daniels. He spoke, and she shook her head. He handed her a paper. She tried to step back inside. Two officers moved to the threshold. It was quiet in that tense way that makes your ears ring. Then she stepped out with her hands in front of her. They cuffed her. She kept her chin high, stared straight ahead. And for a second, I saw the camera version of her try to take over. It did not work here. They walked her to the car. A neighbor across the street gasped loud enough to carry, then covered her mouth with her hand. Someone else raised a phone, and then thought better of it and lowered it again. The door closed and the cruiser pulled away. The street felt too bright after that. Clarice and I sat down again. I could not tell what I felt. Relief was in there somewhere, but it was tangled up with something like grief. No matter what she had done, she was still the woman my son had loved. She was also the woman who had grabbed my hair and shoved me to the floor and then tried to frighten the one person brave enough to help me. Two truths, side by side, and none of it simple. Ethan came home within the hour. He walked straight through the back gate, like a man who had forgotten what doors are for. His face was pale and shocked. He asked if I had seen. I said I had. He sat at Clarice's table and stared at his hands. He said he had just gotten the call from an officer at the jail. He said they were holding Savannah on charges of harassment and assault, and that there would be an arraignment in the morning. He said the words as if he were reciting someone else's life. He looked at me then and asked if I was happy. The question landed heavy between us. I told him I did not feel happy. I told him I felt safe. He nodded and did not argue. He said he had failed both of us. Clarice poured him a glass of water and set it in front of him with the same care she uses when placing a fragile cup on a shelf. In the afternoon, my phone rang again. A man introduced himself as Tom Reeves from a magazine called Everyday Justice. He said he had read about my story and the arrest and wanted to write a feature focusing on the neighbor who refused to look away and the mother who found her voice. He said he did not need drama. He needed detail and truth. His voice carried the patience of a person who listens for a living. I told him I would talk if Clarice agreed. Clarice said she would. As long as the piece did not turn me into a symbol and forget I am a person. Tom said he would come by tomorrow with a photographer who knew how to keep a respectful distance. We ended the call, and the house grew quiet again. Ethan stood and said he needed to go to the station to ask about the arraignment. He asked if I needed anything from the store. The ordinary kindness of the question almost undid me. I asked for milk. He nodded as if I had given him a task that could save him. After he left, the day softened at the edges. Clarice and I went out to her small garden. She cut a few roses that were on their last good day and put them in a jar from my kitchen. We stood there a long time without saying much. The light on the fence was the warm kind that only happens when the sun finds a hole in the clouds and aims through it. Back in my house, I put the roses on the counter near the place where the tile is stained. The pink looked defiant against the white. I made tea and carried a cup to the living room. The television sat dark. I did not turn it on. My phone vibrated with messages that I chose not to read yet. Brenda sent a brief note that said she had heard and that she was thinking of me. Evelyn emailed to say the financial investigation was moving forward and that the district attorney would likely add charges related to exploitation. I placed the phone face down and let the quiet breathe. Ethan returned at dusk with milk and a loaf of bread and an expression I recognized from his boyhood. The one he wore after a first bad grade. He said the arraignment would be at 9 in the morning and that he did not know whether to go. I told him he should do what he needed to do. He asked if I would go. I said I did not know. It was the truth. We ate toast at the counter like people who had run out of energy for complicated meals. He said very little. I said very little. Sometimes you sit with the emptiness because it is the only honest thing in the room. When he went upstairs, I wandered to the window. The street was quiet again. The spot where the cruisers had idled already looked ordinary. The hydrangeas along the front walk moved in the slight breeze. Across the fence, Clarice turned off her lamp. The neighborhood settled into its nightly rhythm, as if nothing monumental had happened at all. I rinsed the tea mug and left it to dry. I turned off lights one by one and let the house darken around me until only the hallway lamp remained. In the drawer by the stove, the folder of numbers and letters lay where I had left it. Proof beside proof. I closed the drawer and rested my palm on the wood. I was not happy. I was not triumphant. But the air in the room felt steady. The floor under my feet felt like it belonged to me again. Outside. A late car rolled past and faded. Inside. The clock kept its soft count. I stood there and let the stillness settle. Knowing morning would bring more calls and questions. And knowing I could meet them, sitting upright in my own chair. The next morning dawned with a kind of uneasy calm. The kind that comes after too many storms. The air was cool. And the sunlight came in slow. Soft streaks across the kitchen counter. The roses Clarice had given me were still fresh, their petals curling slightly at the edges but standing strong in the jar. I brewed coffee and stood by the sink, staring at the steam rising, trying not to think about what the day would bring. By 8:30, Ethan came down the stairs, freshly shaven but pale. He had on a suit I hadn't seen him wear in months. He said he was heading to the courthouse. I asked if he was sure he wanted to go. He said she was still his wife, and that he had to. His voice cracked a little at the end. I didn't argue. I only told him to be careful. After he left, the house fell into that strange, waiting kind of silence again. I washed the breakfast dishes slowly, listening to the sound of the water, the birds outside, the world moving on as if it didn't care about our small disasters. Around 9:15, my phone buzzed. It was Clarice. She said the local station was broadcasting the arraignment live. I hesitated, then turned on the TV. The screen filled with the courthouse steps. Reporters lined up behind yellow tape. Then I saw her. Savannah. Her hair pulled back, her face bare of the usual glow and filters. The camera caught her walking with two officers, wrists cuffed loosely in front of her. She didn't look at anyone. The reporter's voice said words like arraignment, harassment, elder abuse, and obstruction. But all I could focus on was Savannah's eyes. They looked empty, as if the lights had gone out somewhere inside her. When the camera cut to the courtroom feed, Ethan was there in the back row. He looked like a man trying to disappear into his own shoulders. The judge spoke in a calm, tired voice. Savannah's lawyer requested bail. The prosecutor objected. They mentioned the threats, the financial evidence, the assault. Savannah's lawyer kept interrupting, talking fast. She barely spoke, just stared down at her hands. When the judge finally ruled for release on bond with restricted contact, Savannah didn't move. She didn't even flinch. I turned off the TV. My chest hurt, though I couldn't tell if it was sadness or relief. Maybe both. I stood at the window, watching the trees bend slightly in the wind, somewhere deep inside. I knew there was no version of this that ended cleanly. By afternoon, the neighborhood had gone back to its usual rhythm. Dogs barked. Sprinklers clicked. Mail trucks came and went. Clarice stopped by with sandwiches from the cafe down the street. She didn't mention the broadcast. And I was grateful. We ate at the kitchen table again. Our small ritual now. She told me she'd started getting messages from women all over Oregon after the news article came out. Older women, mostly, saying they saw themselves in us. Some said they'd lived in silence for years. Some said they finally called for help. Clarice smiled faintly. She said maybe this whole mess had done some good after all. That evening, my phone rang again. Brenda. She said, Channel 7 wanted to invite me to a televised town hall they were organizing, focused on elder respect and digital harassment. They were calling it Respect Our Moms. She said she wouldn't push me, but the movement had already started, and people wanted to see the woman whose story sparked it. I told her I wasn't sure I belonged on a stage. She said I didn't need to perform, just to show up. Sometimes, presence was louder than words. When I hung up, I sat with that for a while. The thought of going on television terrified me. But there was a pull I couldn't ignore. For so long, people like me stayed quiet because we thought no one would listen. Maybe it was time to see what happened when we spoke. Later that night, Ethan came home. He looked older somehow. Like the weight of the day had carved new lines into his face. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. He said she had pleaded not guilty. I asked if he'd spoken to her. He said yes. Briefly. She told him not to come again. He said she looked right through him. He sat at the table, head in his hands. I asked if he still loved her. He didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know what love is anymore." I wanted to tell him love wasn't supposed to hurt like this. But I didn't. Some truths have to be found, not given. He said he was thinking about selling the business. What was left of it? He said maybe he'd move somewhere quieter. Maybe the coast. Then he looked at me and asked what I would do. I said I didn't know yet. But I wanted to start helping other people in my position. He smiled a little. Tired but genuine. He said that sounded like something good. After he went upstairs, I sat at the table alone again. I looked at the roses on the counter. Now wilting. Petals curling inward, like they were folding themselves up for rest. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. I thought about all the women who had written to me. All the ones who hadn't but wanted to. I thought about the years I'd spent keeping peace by staying silent. About how peace without dignity isn't really peace at all. Maybe that was what this was all leading to. Not punishment. Not revenge. But reclamation. I washed the teacup I'd been holding and set it upside down to dry. The house felt different now. Lighter, in some invisible way. I walked to the front door and looked out at the street. The pavement shimmered faintly from the earlier rain. The air smelled like wet soil and possibility. From across the fence, Clarice's voice floated through the dusk. She called out that the community center downtown was planning a meeting about senior rights next week, and that Brenda would be there. She asked if I wanted to go with her. I told her yes before I could think twice. She smiled, said she'd pick me up at 6, and disappeared back into her house. I stood there for a while after she went inside, my hand resting on the doorframe, the cool wood grounding me. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Not one big moment, but small steps. Quiet evenings. Neighbors who cared. When I finally went to bed, I left the window open just enough to hear the soft hum of the night. The world outside was still moving, still rebuilding itself. Just like me. The night air drifted in through the open window, carrying the faint hum of traffic from the main road. I fell asleep later than usual and woke up to the smell of coffee already brewing. For a second, I thought Savannah was in the kitchen again. But then I remembered Ethan had taken to making coffee early these days. As if routine could hold his life together. He greeted me softly when I walked in. Voice hoarse. Eyes tired but clearer. He said he'd spoken to his lawyer and that the charges against Savannah were officially being filed in court next week. I nodded. Neither of us said much after that. We just sat, sipping coffee in the quiet. Two people trying to rebuild the idea of family from the ruins. Later that morning, the mail arrived. There was a letter addressed to me from Silver Shield Legal Aid, the same organization Evelyn worked for. Inside was a formal statement confirming the closing of my fraud case. They had recovered nearly all the money Savannah had taken. It was sitting in a holding account, ready to be transferred back to me. My hand shook a little as I read it. Relief. Disbelief. And something else, maybe the faint sting of what it meant to have needed protection in the first place. Ethan looked over my shoulder and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He said he was glad I was getting it back. I told him it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about being seen. He nodded and said, I understand. In the afternoon, I met Brenda and Clarice downtown at the community center for the meeting about elder rights. The room was filled with women like me. Some older, some younger, all with that same quiet resilience in their faces. There were folding chairs, weak coffee in paper cups, and a low hum of conversation that felt both heavy and hopeful. Brenda stood near the front, speaking to a small group of reporters who had come to cover the event. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. She waved me over and introduced me to a woman named Linda Carter, founder of the Voices of Mothers initiative. Linda had a warm presence, the kind that filled the room without ever needing to raise her voice. She thanked me for sharing my story and said it had inspired her to expand the program nationally. I didn't know what to say except thank you. During the panel, I sat with Clarice in the second row. The speakers talked about laws that protected seniors from abuse, about the power of community witnesses, about how silence was the biggest weapon abusers used. When Brenda mentioned my story as an example, the room fell still. People turned to look at me, not out of pity, but recognition. Some smiled, some nodded. One woman wiped her eyes. I felt the warmth of Clarice's hand on mine. After the event, several women came up to speak with me. One said her daughter-in-law reminded her of Savannah, controlling everything down to what she ate. Another said she hadn't spoken to her son in years, but watching my interview made her want to call him. I listened, hugged them, and told them what I had learned the hard way, that it's never too late to take your voice back. When we left the center, the sun had already dipped behind the buildings, throwing the sky into shades of orange and pink. Clarice and I walked to her car slowly, neither of us speaking. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. That evening, Ethan came by with takeout from the diner down the street. He said he wanted to have dinner together. We sat at the table, unwrapping sandwiches, and he said he had made a decision. He was going to sell what was left of his business and move into a small apartment nearby. He said he needed to start over, learn how to live without pretending everything was fine. He asked if I thought he was doing the right thing. I told him that sometimes the right thing doesn't feel right at first. It just feels necessary. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said he'd written something for me. I opened it and saw that it was a letter to the local newspaper. He'd written about me, about how the world often forgets the quiet women who hold families together even as they fall apart. He ended it with a sentence that made my throat tighten. My mother taught me what real courage looks like, and it doesn't come with applause. I didn't speak for a long time after reading it. He looked nervous, like he thought I'd be angry. Instead, I stood up and hugged him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. The next week, Brenda's story aired again, this time nationally. The movement that had started as a hashtag became something larger. People from across the country shared stories of mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and neighbors who had faced their own quiet battles. The words, "Respect our moms," appeared on signs, on t-shirts, even on a billboard near the highway outside Beaverton. It didn't feel real. Evelyn called to tell me that the district attorney had finalized Savannah's plea deal. She would serve community service hours and be barred from working in public media for 3 years. When Evelyn asked if I wanted to attend the final hearing, I said no. I didn't need to see her face again to know it was over. Clarice came by that evening with a small stack of mail. She handed me an envelope from a magazine. Inside was a printed copy of Tom Reeves's article titled "A Mother Pushed Down for Soup and How the Internet Stood Up." I read it twice before I could put it down. It wasn't sensational. It was honest. He'd written about Clarice, about the courage it takes to do the right thing quietly, about how sometimes justice doesn't start in courtrooms but across fences between neighbors. As the weeks passed, life began to take on a new rhythm. I started volunteering at the library with Clarice, helping with the senior reading group every Thursday morning. Ethan stopped by often. Sometimes just to bring coffee. Sometimes just to talk. There were moments when the old pain surfaced, but they didn't control the room anymore. One afternoon, while shelving books, I overheard two women talking in the next aisle. They were discussing the news story. "My story," one said. "That woman was brave," the other replied. "She just told the truth." I smiled quietly to myself. Maybe that was all bravery really was. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Clarice's porch light flicked on, and she waved from across the yard. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted in the air. The world kept moving. Softer now, but still moving. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something bad to happen. I felt steady, present, alive. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the story wasn't ending. It was simply changing shape, like light shifting across a quiet room. The morning, the car picked me up for the airport. A thin fog sat over the cedar trees, and the street looked like it was holding its breath. I packed light. A navy dress, low heels, a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender from my closet. Clarice hugged me on the porch and told me to breathe. Brenda texted that she would meet me at the hotel. I locked the door and ran my hand over the wood, the way I always do now. A small ritual that reminds me I own the quiet inside. Washington felt bigger than I remembered. The driver took me past the long curve of the river and the white pillars of buildings I had only seen on television. At the convention center, the banner stretched across the entrance in blue letters that seemed to float. "Stand up for seniors." Inside, the hum of voices rolled like soft thunder. I could feel the energy of 1,000 small stories waiting for air. Backstage, Linda Carter found me and pressed my hands between hers. Her palms were cool and steady. She said the room was full, that people had flown in from every corner, that my story had given them permission to bring their own. Evelyn stood nearby with a legal pad, always prepared, and Brenda adjusted the clip on my microphone with the easy care of a sister. Clarice slipped into the first row and gave me a small nod that held months of solidarity. When they called my name, I stepped into the wash of lights and saw a sea of faces and sensible shoes and eyes that had learned patience the hard way. I set my notes on the lectern and did not look at them. I told them who I had been when all of this began. A retired teacher with a careful pantry and a kitchen that had stopped feeling like home. I told them about the soup and the shove, and the way silence can make you think you are safe, while it erases you one small day at a time. I told them about the neighbor who lifted a camera and a hand, the officer who asked simple questions without judgment, the caseworker who named what I could not name for myself, the lawyer who put my voice into a document that would not be ignored, the reporter who asked and then waited while I found words. I did not talk about vengeance. I spoke about dignity. I said that respect is not a favor, and that love without it will grind you down to dust. I said none of us are headlines. We are kitchens and porches and early morning coffee and names on deeds. I said the picture that spread across the internet did not save me. It only told the truth. What saved me was saying it out loud and letting other people say it with me. There was a quiet, when I finished, that felt like a held breath. Then the room rose as one. Not loud at first. More like a wave that keeps coming. I stood and let it wash over me until it softened into a kind of gentle roar. On the edge of the stage, Brenda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Linda stepped forward and hugged me. I saw Clarice in the front row with her chin up and her mouth set in that line that means pride. Afterward, people came in a slow stream. A woman from Florida told me she had moved back into her own house after 2 years on her daughter's couch. A retired nurse from Minnesota said she had filed her first report last week and slept through the night for the first time in a year. A man with a gray ponytail said he had finally believed his mother when she said she was not clumsy, just tired of being pushed. I listened and held hands, and felt the weight of their stories settle into the fabric of my dress like something holy. In the evening, we walked the long path by the reflecting pool. The sky turned the soft kind of gold that makes even strangers look tender. Brenda carried her shoes and laughed about the blisters that come with good work. Evelyn talked about a new clinic for seniors who need legal help before a crisis. Clarice walked with me, in that companionable silence that has become our language. We stopped and looked at the monuments lit up against the darkening sky. I felt small and strong at the same time, like a thread that knows it belongs to a larger weave. The next morning, I flew home, with a tote full of pamphlets and notes, and a badge with my name spelled right. Beaverton greeted me with rain on the windshield and the comfort of the same grocery store aisles. I unlocked the door, and the house breathed like it always does. The roses on the counter had opened wider, petals soft and brave. I put the kettle on and checked my email while the water came to a murmur. There was a message from Ethan. He wrote that he had started volunteering at the community center to teach basic tech to seniors on Tuesday nights. He said he was learning more than he was teaching. He told me he had been meeting with someone every week to talk about anger and control and the kind of man he did not want to be anymore. He did not ask for anything. He did not make promises. He wrote that he was trying and that he hoped I was well. I read it twice and sat with it. Then I wrote back that I was glad to hear he was showing up for something that mattered and that I was taking things one day at a time. I told him that trying counts when you do it every day. I pressed send and let the message go like a bird I did not need to cage. News came quietly that month. A small item on the station said Savannah had begun her community service hours at a shelter on the east side. There was no photo and no commentary. I felt a flicker of something like mercy, not for what she did, but for the part of her that might still be capable of learning. I set the paper aside and watered the fern that is finally thriving in this light. Time found a rhythm. On Thursdays, Clarice and I set out the folding chairs in the library meeting room, and the Respect Our Moms circle filled with voices that used to stay home. Some nights, we had 5 women. Some nights 20. We talked about boundaries and budgets, and the courage it takes to ask a neighbor for help. We laughed more than anyone who only knew the headlines would expect. We passed around banana bread and second chances. Brenda dropped by when she could and sat in the back, taking notes like a student. Evelyn sent flyers and phone numbers and a promise that no one would be turned away for lack of money. Officer Daniels came once in plain clothes and listened for an hour before he introduced himself and told the room that calling early was not overreacting. It was wisdom. On a Sunday in late spring, Ethan came by with a bag of groceries and a bunch of daisies so bright they looked like small suns. He said he would fix the sticky drawer and asked if I wanted to learn how to use the new video chat app the seniors liked. We sat at the table side by side. Our words were careful, but the air did not tremble. When he left, he put his hand over mine and said he would see me Thursday at the library. He kept his voice quiet, and I let the moment sit without naming it. That night, I stood by the kitchen window and watched the last light lie thin across the fence. The stain on the tile is still there. A small shadow where the soup met the floor. I used to hate it. Now, it reminds me that truth leaves marks and that some marks are worth keeping. The house is not perfect. Neither am I. But it is mine again. And I am mine again. And that is enough. If you are reading this with your jaw set and your heart tight, I hope you hear what I learned too late. You are not a burden. You do not have to earn ordinary kindness. If you have a story crowding your chest, share it here, so none of us have to carry these rooms alone. If this journey helped you, or someone you love, stay with us. Add your voice, and pass it on to one person who needs to hear it. The quiet we keep together becomes a chorus. And sometimes, a single photo is enough to show us where the light has been waiting all along.